This content includes reference to gender-based violence, including sexual violence, which may be distressing or traumatizing to viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. Gender-based violence is often treated as a social crisis, but what if it is also a measure of whether our institutions, workplaces, and partnerships are fit for the future at all? Today, I speak to Prof Corné Davis-Buitendag about GBV as a sustainability challenge, what multi-sector action really means, and where South Africa still needs to move beyond good intentions. Thanks so much for joining us, Prof. We really do appreciate it. I think let's start off with the conversation around what GBV really reveals in our society, because oftentimes we just report on the surface and we actually don't go deep into what GBV is actually telling us about what's really going on in our society.
Well, I think people often confuse the scope of GBV because it refers to emotional, verbal, financial, physical, and sexual abuse perpetrated against another person because of their gender. So often people underestimate the impact of the emotional, verbal, and psychological abuse, and therefore they don't classify it as gender-based violence. But those are the initial stages of it that then escalates to physical and sexual violence. And that is why I believe that people don't realize how broad that scope is.
Why do you think it is that people underestimate the impact of verbal abuse? Because many would say that sometimes has a bigger and harder impact on a victim.
I think it's because people want to think that if it's physical, somebody being physically abused, there's evidence which shows that it's a problem. But the verbal abuse starts from childhood. It depends on the environment that we grow up in, our family environment, how people speak to each other. Remember that South Africa also has one of the highest divorce rates. So a healthy environment is actually rare because people have been conditioned to believe that verbal abuse is not abuse, while it escalates into far more than that and it causes untold psychological damage, which is as bad as physical damage.
Maybe if you could weigh in on the issue of how men and boys are also abused. When we post a lot of the segments that we do on Voices of Change, a lot of people also speak about what men are subjected to and what men go through. And because it's so bad for women and girl children, we often forget about what the men go through.
It's very significant because I believe, remember, we're not born in a particular way that we are abusive. We are socialized to become abusive. And I believe the environments in which we grow up, and remember that we are still living in a patriarchal society, that means that gender stereotyping is still very real. We think it's outgrown when we say boys don't cry and how men must behave and all of these things. They still persist. So there is still the cultures, many cultures, wherein male voices are suppressed, where their emotional expression is limited. And that obviously, if you just think about it, in the nervous system, what kind of buildup that is, that actually, I believe, increases aggression because boys are socialized that way in many cultures. And I do believe that men are very much subjected to verbal abuse. In relationships, it goes both ways. And it's underestimated the impact that it has and how that contributes to violent behavior and aggression.
How does that tie in? And I hope I'm able to phrase what's my thought currently. We live in a country where women and children are raped, murdered very often. The numbers are very scary. How do we find a way to deal with the leadership crisis that we might have that could impact the way we're dealing with gender-based violence in this country, and perhaps that we have more men in these leadership positions than women?
Well, the gender equality problem persists. We know that. I mean, if you just look at the annual PricewaterhouseCoopers report and you look at the way that leadership roles are still mostly male-dominated, we know that that is a problem. We also know that when you look, for example, at the State of the Nation address, where budgets were allocated to multiple causes and issues, but when it came to gender-based violence, which is a national crisis, it's been declared that no specific budget was allocated to addressing the problem. So there you're talking at a certain level of leadership when you talk about how do we address the problem. We also have a leadership issue in terms of men speaking out against gender-based violence or aiming to change perpetrator behaviour. There are many programs in place and many NGOs working, and all of these things are going on in the background, but we're not getting at the ground level.
Yeah.
In my opinion, our problem is that you do not see bottom-up leadership. And that is something that we need to focus, although we don't want to really talk about, working with perpetrators and assisting perpetrators. It has to start that we change behavior and that we do work with perpetrators, because the perpetrators are becoming younger. I was talking to Monique from Matla, Bana yesterday, and a big trend now is that because of children's exposure to pornography, your perpetrators are becoming younger. And I'm talking about 12 years old and younger, where they are becoming perpetrators, not even aware that they are perpetrators, because where are the male figures and how do we see that children are now increasingly exposed to pornography?
I mean, that is alarming, and it's so heartbreaking. How do we change? Should we be changing the language? Because, I mean, you just said now we have so many NGOs, we have so many programs, and I don't want to be negative, but I just don't see the change that we should be seeing when it comes to GBV. Like, every time you hear of a case or a matter, it just gets worse. The perpetrator gets more violent, more aggressive, and just more brutal. Should we be changing the language around GBV?
Our problem has always been the stigma associated. First, like I said, the scope, what we define as GBV is a problem, because a lot of behavior is not seen as GBV while it is. But also our problem has always been the stigma. That means that victims do not report or can come forward, or they're often, many cases, as we know, financially dependent on perpetrators. And the stigma around it means you do not see the engagement, even on social media, about the topic of gender-based violence. It's a topic that's uncomfortable. And if we want to change something, we need to change the uncomfortableness of the topic, because victims remain isolated. There's not enough engagement. There's not enough coming forward because of the stigma and shame. And if we want to change something, I believe we do need to make more anonymous platforms available where people can speak out, that it becomes more known. Because while we attach identities to victims in public engagement, they're not going to talk. The fear, the stigma, the shame, the blame.
What about the role of private sector? Because oftentimes you will be perhaps harassed or made to feel uncomfortable in a workplace, and it's almost like we've been programmed to say, don't talk about it. If you talk about it, you're probably going to lose your job. No one's going to believe you. And the role that the private sector actually needs to play in addressing GBV that could emanate from the workplace.
Interesting that you asked that. We published a study in 2022. I personally conducted interviews with 76 CEOs in that study, and we did a survey among employees across South Africa. So for the employees, we wanted to understand their awareness, knowledge, perceptions, beliefs about GBV, and for the CEOs, we also wanted to know their awareness and intentions about addressing GBV. So what came out of the employee survey, which was interesting, is that most people were very much aware of the whole scope of GBV And the key message was that they required support in the workplace. So this is, remember, coming from private sector employees. They wanted information. They believed that there should be support programs, part of employee well-being programs, where they could be educated and referred to support services and so forth for addressing GBV. So the role of the private sector is enormous in terms of putting those things into place. Because remember, at the moment, your legislation and your company policies still very much cover sexual harassment. You know, after the Me Too movement and all that happened, Harvey Weinstein and those cases, sexual harassment became on the map, and most organizations do have sexual harassment policies. That is standard. That does not mean that has reduced sexual harassment, because in the same vein, you're still sitting with the issue of stigma and non-reporting and perpetrators still being protected to some extent because of reputation. So progress has been made, but there's still a need to actually provide information, education, awareness, and references to support within private sector organizations.
You speak about the support and the awareness, and you might have a victim that says, you can give me all the support and you can educate me, but I'm still not going to report what's happening to me. The risk is just too big, and I'll rather just suffer in silence and try and forget about what happened to me. How do we address that? Because if it's happening to one woman or one victim, it's most likely happening to many more. How do we address the issue of people being scared to speak out and face the perpetrator head on?
People are going to be scared, because remember what's at risk. You're at risk of losing your job and getting involved in a legal process. Then we talk about secondary abuse. So people are going to be scared. But if we say support, I believe that there's a room, especially with the advent of social media and the way that there are platforms, like I said, where people can engage anonymously. Because when you get support and you hear the voices of other people who are victims, other people going through it, that may strengthen you. That may give you the courage to do something about it. But people who don't want to speak out often feel isolated. They feel they'll have no support. Then remember, there's victim blaming. That often happens. So
what did you do?
What did you do?
Yeah.
So it's that. So if we can offer more platforms where people can speak out without being identified, that could maybe build that little bridge between keeping quiet and actually going to report. We see now, for example, if you look at Matla, Bana, I spoke to Monique yesterday, and she was saying there are a lot more people now coming forward many years later after the abuse. There has been a successful case recently because they could never speak about it. But now, just from engaging about it, that was the case of Roche that was on Facebook, more people are now willing to report the child sexual abuse 10 years, 15 years later, and that success can be achieved.
Funny you mention that, because many years ago, I don't want to give away how long I've been a journalist, but it was one of my first stories at the Star newspaper, and it was a young girl, and she was sexually assaulted by a very close family person, and she was a grown woman, and she reported, and this was happening to her when she was very young, and it was such a tragic story because she obviously had to relive all of that trauma, but he was sentenced and convicted all those years later. I want to go into the element of having to prove that it happened, because how do you prove that, this person's making me feel uncomfortable, making unnecessary comments, and then it maybe eventually leads into an assault or a rape. And that often might deter someone from reporting, because how do I prove it?
You see, in many cases, remember, like you said, child sexual abuse is usually perpetrated by people known to the victim. It's the father, the stepfather, the uncle, the cousin, the friend of the family. So that is because they are not strangers. In many cases, children are blackmailed emotionally, and they are fearful, so that it's impossible for them to report it at that time. But as they grow older, why would a person make a case if something did not happen? And there is a process to follow where the evidence can be produced by the witness statement in terms of what the person experienced. People remain traumatized, and that is actually, it's interesting. That is how my career as a GBV activist started. Was in 2013, my students did a project for Matla, Bana. And at that time, I knew about gender-based violence, but I wasn't an activist yet. And they alerted me to the prevalence of child sexual abuse. And they were about 21 years old at the time. And then when they did the project and they presented their campaigns, they came forward one after the other, and they spoke out about it for the first time. And that's how I became an activist, because of my students. And
Wow.
and those cases are real. And if they report and they recall the incidents, those cases can be prosecuted successfully. It doesn't need the physical evidence and the DNA. It's the account of the victim.
Interesting you mentioned DNA, because we know what a mess DNA is in this country. I'm a victim, and they said to me that the DNA found doesn't match the person they believe is behind it. And then they said, but actually we think we didn't take enough DNA. And I was like, well, that doesn't help me, because now what? What role I don't want to make this about government, because, we all have feelings about how they handle certain things, but what role should they be playing in addressing the stigma, misinformation around GBV and how things should be dealt with, both government and even the private sector?
Look, the government, if you look at the scope, it's not a uniform body. There are different departments and bodies involved. You're looking at the National Prosecuting Authority that feeds into government, that's your legal system. Then you work at laws in itself, and we know that we have the most advanced laws. We know how the laws have been adjusted and all of that. But the role of government should be focused on how do we actually fund projects that work. You've got the Department of Women and People with Disability. They have programs running. They do fund several organizations that work with it. But government should be playing a far proactive role, like I say, bottom up. There's a need for community work. And for that, there's a need for budget. There needs to be resources to do so.
Mm.
And that is the biggest role of government at the moment, because most of the work, if you look at the reports on GBV and whatever small measures of success have been achieved, that was done by non-government organizations who are still at the forefront of fighting GBV, and many of them are not funded. They rely on private funding and supporting the bodies who are actually doing the work. That is what government should be doing.
And the private sector?
The private sector are, at the moment, they are contributing funds. I know there's been the Private Sector Symposium that's been led by the Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Fund. I was actually there this week because they funded a project at UJ looking at GBV and the nightlife. So the private sector at this stage is still, we're looking at the contribution of funds, which is great. That is one point. But I'm still saying the private sector should be doing the employee well-being programs, because GBV occurs across all socioeconomic sectors, and you need the support and intervention there more than even money. We need that from the private sector.
And you speak about the role that government plays. There's always been a call for there to be a specific court that deals with GBV, that deals with the abuse that not just women and children are subjected to, but gender-based violence cases. Do you think that will help or make any sorts of difference?
Now you're talking about courts, but remember, we're still sitting with the problem of reporting. You can only prosecute and deal with cases that are reported. So the statistics vary. You never know what is the most accurate, but we're still sitting with a figure hanging there that about 93% of cases not reported. Mm. So until we can overcome the reporting and the support mechanisms available to victims, it's not going to help to get more courts. We still have to overcome the reporting issue, and then, like you say, the evidence issue, the DNA, the data collection issue. There are many other issues before we get to court.
How do we further tackle the issue of underreporting? I know I speak about this a lot, but I'm very for speaking about what I've been through and what I've been subjected to, because I feel if I don't speak, I silence myself, and I need to be a voice for those that are scared to speak. But there were moments where I thought I don't, and it took me a while before I actually came out public to say what I've been through. And interestingly, my mother, she's a very staunch Greek woman that believes that you shouldn't tell the world your problems. And she was actually very against me going public about, it was a home invasion. They were in the house. My parents were in the house, and I almost got raped and murdered. And I managed to get away, and not a lot of people do, but she has that mentality, and she means well. She didn't mean it in a bad way, but she was like, to protect yourself, because it's going to open up a whole different world for you. But if my mother has that idea and concept of not reporting it, can you imagine the others? So how do we tackle that?
That is, again, we need to provide safer spaces, because the thing is, what your mother probably also had in mind is that perception of now you're a damaged person.
Yeah.
Now you are like deformed, and you're never going to come right, and you're now damaged. And you don't want society to see you now as a damaged person and to like feel sorry for you. It's the personal identity, it's the self-image that people are scared of, because you have the perception that people are going to think less of you if you come forward and speak out. And that is what we need to change. You are brave for speaking out. You have courage to say what's happened to you, because you and I both know that the number says 1 out of 3. When I spoke to Monique yesterday, it's like more like 1 out of 2 worldwide girls experiencing some kind of sexual abuse in their lifetime. And the fact that we're not speaking out and pretending that we're all okay, that nothing has happened, and that we're normal people. We are normal people. But there has been trauma, and that trauma has not been addressed. And it will not be addressed until women like you and me come forward and say, here we are, we're not damaged, we have a trauma experience that we need to share with others.
Yeah, and I always say it's okay to not be okay. And interestingly, you speak about how society will view me. And I mean, I can literally see my mother saying, be careful, what are people going to say? But I mean, that's a very Greek thing. Mama, if you're listening, I still love you. But it was a very be careful what society is going to say about you. And I feel that really contributes to people not wanting to speak out. And maybe let's tackle that. How do we provide those systems for people to report and speak out, and this misinformation and misconception and stigma around GBV?
Well, if you think about what the opinion leaders doing on the other side of the fence and how they generate influence and support, and I'm speaking the likes of OnlyFans that generate they are influencers. Why can't we have influencers for GBV who tell their stories and who generate conversations on social media platforms? Because at the moment, if you look at how GBV is being addressed, people still not keen to make comments. The topic is not so live. People are still uncomfortable about coming forward. But what do we have influencers who actually say, people like you, people like me, who say, these are the things that have happened. Let's talk about this openly. Then surely we can engage about that without feeling the shame for it, because the reality is that the majority of women have experienced it. And by keeping it quiet and denying it and acting that everything is okay, well, we know it's not okay, and that we do need to speak out about it if you want to change anything.
I like what you say about, influencers, GBV influencers, those that are close to the matter, have their own experiences, because you're right. If you and I had to walk around just for 5 minutes and get people, especially women, to speak to us, they would probably say, I've had some form of abuse in my life, or some form of experience that I feel I was harassed or made to feel uncomfortable. How important is that partnership?
I think it's absolutely crucial. And like I say, I mean, you say apologies to your mother. I mean, that's true. I can say, well, my father's no longer alive. But in my childhood, my father was walking through the house with a gun and threatening to shoot us all, which was extremely traumatic. And nobody did anything about that. But we do need to say what has actually happened to us. And we don't say we want to expose perpetrators and bring shame on the family. We don't want to bring, but what we do need to say is account for our experiences and allow others to account for their experiences. You know, and even men. We're saying, okay, that many men are harassed and being abused. Allow people to speak out about their experiences, something that's very underreported. And there's been studies done on it. The prevalence of male rape.
Yeah.
That happens. And if you think it's difficult for women to report rape at police stations, imagine for men to report rape. And this is happening. It's a small percentage compared to women being raped. And we know that most cases of rape is not strangers, it's intimate partners. But we do need to speak openly and encourage influencers to share stories. And if you can influence people for all sorts of other reasons, why not influence people to come forward and address the issue of gender-based violence so that we can get to the destigmatization, just like it happened with HIV. It was through a lot of communication and campaigns that the stigma associated with HIV was reduced. Why can't we do the same with GBV?
Interestingly, you speak about the recent statistics reflect that in the last quarter that out of the 9,000 GBV cases, over 4,000 were done in or committed in a house of a loved one or a family, so very intimate. And maybe if your thoughts on that, sometimes it could be your son, your brother, your father that's committing this, and it's a thing of let's not talk about it, or you persuade the person to not report it or drop the charges because what will society say? And he didn't mean it.
Mm-hmm. That's what happened most of the time.
Yeah.
With child sexual abuse, with intimate partner violence, with domestic violence, in most cases, they are not carried through. We've had interviews with family violence and sexual offence unit officers. We're about to publish that article in terms of police perceptions, where they work tirelessly with cases only to see them withdrawn. There is the fear of that, the stigma again, and the fear of the perpetrator. And then, of course, don't underestimate the financial dependence of the perpetrator. And then that whole thing, we're always so concerned, what will other people say? That's always the story. So if we say that, I always say the other people we're talking about are then party to the gender-based violence taking place. Because if other people are what's preventing victims to come forward, then surely other people are the ones who stigmatize as victims. And then we must look at ourselves as a society and say, but we then partly to blame for the victim blaming, for the stigma, because stigma comes from society.
It's such a difficult one. I don't want to end off on a negative note, because I do always want to find the glimmer and the rainbow that will eventually shine. How do we help each other? What proof is there that things are changing and it's not just a conversation or, oh no, we're trying. I mean, we need the proof. Maybe the proof, and then also what we can do to help.
I believe the proof will be if we can facilitate those conversations that are visible on social media, where everybody can see the conversations. If we can really engage and come together. Do you remember how we as South Africans came together for that Rugby World Cup?
Yeah.
Did you see us? Did you see the South African spirit? Did you see everybody join in and be excited about that? If we could do it for the World Cup, why can't we do this to save our country from this terrible pandemic of gender-based violence? Surely we can do that. We can come together. We can support victims. The other thing that's always important is the bystander approaches. Do you know that many people see what's going on? The law has changed that you're obligated to report and you have to come forward if you witness. Still not coming forward. We know that's not happening. Maybe we can encourage all of us as South Africans, when we do witness that gender-based violence occurring, go and report it. Don't be so concerned and scared about, I don't want to be involved in the court process and I don't want to be a witness and I don't want to complicate my life. It's not complicated. We are complicating our lives by not addressing it because the problem is escalating. If we can encourage every fellow South African to say, if you see it, report it, say something, then we already have a start.
Thanks, Prof. Thanks so much for your insights.
You're welcome.
It was very informative. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. That was Professor Corné Davis-Buitendag reminding us that GBV cannot be solved by isolated outrage or isolated sectors. If it is truly a sustainability challenge, then the real test is whether institutions, partnerships, and leadership begin to change at the level of systems, not slogans. Report any form of gender-based violence to your nearest police station or call 0800 10 111. For more information, go to enca.com or reach out to any of the organizations we've spoken to in this series.